Hello, and welcome to Executive Mosaic's video interview series. I'm Summer Myatt, and here to speak with me today is Jim McAleese, principal at McAleese and Associates and a GovCon expert. Jim, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, ma'am. Good to be in the house.
So, Jim, as a GovCon expert, you've got your finger on the pulse of the GovCon market. Can you talk about some of the big picture trends that you're seeing in the market right now?
The second strategy really tells me, from an Air Force perspective, it is a technology race with respect to China, not a capacity one-for-one race. My observation with the Chinese, ma'am, is that my personal observations, they generally tend not to take dramatic actions unless there's a high probability that they're going to have an outcome. So whatever that number is that President Xi has in his mind, if it's 80% or it's 90%, it would have to be something that's significant. And when I look at the current strategy of the Air Force, this technology competition that the Air Force is really investing into, this RDT&E, this research, development, testing, and evaluation, right? What that really tells me is that those have the ability to get President Xi's attention. Those have the ability to say, the probability of me having a 90% probability of successfully taking Taiwan is now 40% or 50%. And fundamentally, if the U.S. has a long-range ability to mass deep fires into China rather than simply fighting over the Straits of Taiwan, that's something that would get President Xi's attention, because that has the potential of leading to regime change, right? And as you know, ma'am, the 1.4 billion Chinese people they're not monolithic. There's only about 100 million of them that are members of the Chinese Communist Party, and that means that if in a large-scale conflict you have as many as 1.3 Chinese running around who may be less happy with the Chinese Communist Party than the 100 million members of the Chinese Communist Party. The last but not least is a very, very significant chunk of funding that's gone into the U.S. Space Force. There's about a $5 billion increase. So if you look at General Raymond's funding, there's $24.5 billion. The biggest bucket is $15.8 billion for RDT&E. And so there's an enormous slug of money. Yes, the Space Development Agency, run by Dr. Derek Turnier, is coming from the DoD-wide accounts, the Defense Agency accounts, into the Air Force. Yes, that's about $1.5 billion. But the remainder of the money, ma'am, is a big spike in missile warning, missile tracking, right? And so it is highly likely that when the Chinese revealed their September 2021, what they called a fractional orbital bombardment system, or FOBS, F-O-B-S, right? They claimed that it was a reusable spacecraft, a small version of a shuttle, and apparently it achieved a LEO orbit, and then apparently it reportedly then launched a hypersonic glide vehicle that traveled back into China. And so if the U.S. missile warning system and tracking system is conditioned on, I have to be able to detect the launch, if you by chance have somehow managed to conceal some significant number of these weapons in a LEO orbit, then there is the possibility, ma'am, that you could then choose to deorbit those weapons at a time and place of your choosing. In other words, from my outside perspective looking in, it has a terrible potential to be mistaken for a first strike weapon, right? Both as an attack on the U.S. homeland, and as you're aware, ma'am, Guam is the U.S. homeland, right? It's part of the U.S. And there's hundreds of thousands of U.S. citizens there as well. So those are really the three buckets when you look at where's the Air Force putting it. When you go to the Navy and Marine Corps, it's a very simplistic issue. So Admiral Gilday is $181 billion. Their total budget, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have brushed by that. I'm sorry. The total budget is like $231 in the 2023 request, and that's $181 billion for Admiral Gilday, and that'll be another $50 billion for General Berger, right, for the Marine Corps, right? And so they effectively together, the Department of the Navy has grown by about 11% in those 2 years, which basically brings you to about $23 billion of growth. Right. First, the Navy grew, then the Marine Corps grew, right? And it's predominantly in both operations maintenance and then secondarily in procurement. And so when you look at where the Navy is going, the general sense that I get from the Navy leadership is that they are distinctly concerned that a China fight is probably a 2027, 2030 fight. And so given the long lead time to order ships, an aircraft carrier is a 7 to 8 year delivery. Submarine is probably a 5-year delivery. And so high 4 years. And so there's a tremendous focus coming. I see it from Admiral Gilday on, hey, we really need to have this force generation capability of how do we get ships through the depots? How do we get aircraft through the depots? So if this day were to occur, right, then the Navy's ability to mass the largest number of ships in the existing fleet and aircraft in the existing fleet is absolutely critical, right? And so there does seem to be, in my mind, ma'am, a disconnect between where the Navy's urgency of saying, hey, you've got to pay attention to this. This is important to me. There does seem to be a little bit of tone deafness by the contractors to recognize contractors are generally, if you look at any of the major CEOs and look at their executive compensation, it's dependent on each company, but as a practical matter, usually about 50% of that compensation each year, of that 20 million-ish for each of the CEOs of the major primes, from Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop, Raytheon, GD, BAE, L3 Harris, HII, right, all the way to your big 8, right? About 50%, maybe even 60% is a mixture of both the stock price, right, relative to peers, and additionally cash flow generation. And so there is a little bit of messaging that's required from the Navy to really be able to get the attention of industry, because that sense of this urgency, right, in terms of preparing for a 2027 fight, which is really 4 years from now, it is not as obvious as I would have thought it would be at this point in time in the administration, right? And then when you look at the totality of that $69 billion of growth, the 10% growth across the entire department, the Marine Corps, forgive me, I misspoke. So Admiral Gilday would whack me if I said General Berger's name first. So Admiral Gilday and General Berger's portion together as the Department of the Navy, and Secretary Del Toro, who's on top of that, right, it's grown by about 11%. It's about $23 billion of the entire growth. So the Navy Marine Corps has really benefited from about 33% of all of the growth in the department for the last 2 years has gone into the Department of the Navy. The two bill payers by default, ma'am, leaves you with the Army, right? So the Army has basically been flatlined. The Army was proposed for a $4 billion cut in 2022 because the Army was pulling out of Afghanistan. Congress stepped in and restored the $4 billion cut. So the Army stayed flat at about $174 billion in 2022. And the Army is being proposed for about a $3 billion increase in 2023, which is about a 2% increase to $177 billion. However, right, as you're well aware from inflation, when you look inside Secretary Wormuth, the Army Secretary, and General McConville, the Chief Staff of the Army, when you look inside their budget, what you see is the the money to pay the troops, the 4.6% military pay raise in 2023 actually jumps by $3 billion alone. And that's even with 12,000 fewer soldiers temporarily in 2023, falling from 485,000 active duty in 2022 down to 472,000 in 2023. And then on top of that, there's another $4 billion spike in Army operations and maintenance to pay for quality of life, plus to pay for the readiness, right, to be able to fight, right? And so what's happening inside the Army budget is it's increasing by $3 billion, but the two giant beast accounts in there are increasing by 7. And so by default, ma'am, there's a $4 billion negative cut. And so even without inflation, and so you notice that in the congressional hearings, when they talk about the MILCON, there's about a $1.4 billion cut out of the MILCON, and there's about almost a $3 billion cut out of some of the RDT&E, the $13 billion RDT&E account, and there's about a $2 billion cut out of the Army procurement account. And so, but they were, the Army leadership, to their credit, ma'am, they were very careful about focusing on what the Secretary and Chief called the 24 programs by 2023. So these are all of the priorities in terms of long-range fires, in terms of mobile protected firepower, in terms of the ability for social lethality, integrated visual augmentation system, in terms of, so across the board, whether you're talking about long-range fires or combat vehicles or future vertical lift, where that big EMD award will happen here in September of this year, or whether you're talking about the network or you're talking about integrated air missile defense, or soldier lethality. There's really about 24 of those programs that should be able to demonstrate by the end of 2023 enough maturity that the Army leadership can actually make the big bet decisions going forward about which of the programs really should get the dominant portions of funding, right? And then the last but not least, ma'am, so, if you're, Defense Health Program or DODEA or Missile Defense Agency or DARPA, or even SOCOM, General Clark from SOCOM, you're in that residual bucket. That residual bucket does not have a service secretary, right? It's called DOD wide or defense agencies, and that's about 131 billion. And basically, ma'am, they limit it to about 17% of the budget. So as the Defense Health Program grows every year, and as Department of DOD education grows every year, by default, things like Missile Defense Agency or things like SOCOM, those generally tend to be the bill payers. Right. The second trend I would look for is we are going to see a significant reaction in terms of an increase of some extra money in 2023. Right. And so we've seen 3 of the 4 bills. You're obviously well aware that the administration has asked for a $31 billion increase, which is a 4% increase in 2023. That's the $773 billion, right, DoD budget request 2023. However, the administration has also asked for a $78 billion growth in domestic. And so the significant number of members of Congress, both in the House and the Senate, are saying, hey, there has to be, particularly with Putin invading Ukraine, there has to be a reevaluation of the $78 billion or 11% of proposed 2023 domestic growth versus the only 31% or 4% of proposed 2023 DoD growth. So what the investors have generally tended to think